So my feeling is that food may be the one thing that would overcome the weariness and the wariness on each side, and at least bring people to a table and have a chance to talk about these things. And in addition to food, I think faith is another connector that can make those connections happen.
My name is Linda Lorelle, and I'm asking you to have the courage to listen with an open mind to all of our voices, because our voices matter. Hi, everybody. It's Linda Lorelle, and this is Our Voices Matter podcast. If you are a foodie, and especially if you're a soul foodie, you are going to love this episode. My guest today is Adrian Miller, 2 times James Beard Foundation Book Award winner. And you might also recognize him from his work on the 4-part docuseries on Netflix, High on the Hog, How African American Cuisine Transformed America. Now, Adrian has quite the eclectic backstory, starting with a BA in International Relations from Stanford, a law degree from Georgetown. He does social justice work. And of course, there's all the work that he does in the food space. And it's fascinating to see how he connects the dots with all of these different elements of his background. So excited for you to enjoy this conversation with Adrian Miller. So let's get to it. Okay, Adrian Miller, I cannot believe that we finally pulled this off. We've been trying to make this podcast happen for quite some time, and I'm so glad we finally did. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. It's good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation to be on your podcast.
Of course. So we're relatively new friends, having met earlier this year, but you are one of those guys, I have to say, that when you first meet you, it's like, oh my gosh, I feel like I've known him forever. And I feel like I could talk to him forever. You just have that kind of infectious personality. So, okay. I want you to tell our audience, you have such an incredibly eclectic background. When people ask you, Adrian, what do you do? Tell me a little bit about you and who you are and what you do. What's your answer?
Well, so my short answer is I am a soul food scholar. My tagline is dropping knowledge like hot biscuits. So I'm a food writer, recovering attorney, former politico, certified barbecue judge. And my day job is I run the Colorado Council of Churches, which is about getting churches to get to know each other beyond their denominational silos and then doing social justice work collectively.
Okay. So we have a lot to cover. So let's start with how you became the soul food scholar. How did you go from Georgetown law and practicing law to all of a sudden being known as the soul food scholar? What happened there?
Yeah. So the short answer is unemployment, but I'll give you the longer answer, which, inspires a lot of things, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I was practicing law, and 25 years ago, my goal was to practice law for several years and then start my political career in Colorado. My ambition at that time was to become the senator, one of the Colorado U.S. senators at some point. So I wanted to do that. So I was practicing law and I just hated it. And this is not to disparage any of your learners or listeners who are attorneys or have attorneys in their family. It just got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office, and it was so bad that white people were joining in. So that just gives you an idea of what it's like at law firms. I mean, you'd be at the copier and you say, hey, Becky, what's going on? And she would look at me and say, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Like, dang. So I was going to open up. So I knew I had to do something else. So I was going to actually open up a soul food restaurant. And then I got a chance to, I heard from a law school classmate who was working in the Clinton White House. And so I got a chance to work in the Clinton White House on something called the Initiative for One America. And when that ended, I was trying to get back to Colorado. Job market was really slow. I was watching a lot of daytime television. Not even going to tell you what shows. And in the depth of my depravity, I said, I should read something.
I know, soap operas, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, worse than that.
Soap operas and talk shows.
Yeah. So I went to a local bookstore and I found this book on the history of Southern food called Southern Food at Home, on the Road in History, written by a guy named John Edgerton. And in that book, he wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cookery has yet to be written. And the book was about 14 years old when I picked it up. And so I just thought, oh, well, that's interesting. And then the second thing I thought is, well, it's been 14 years. Somebody's done this. So I just reached out to the author and told him I was a fan of his work and that he wrote this one sentence. Did he think it was still true in 2001? And he said, yeah, nobody's taken on the full story. There's always room for another voice. So why not yours? So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that's really what started the journey.
Wow. I just love that. So, you have now won a couple of James Beard Foundation book awards. One was for soul food. The other was, tell me the other one. It just went right out of my head.
Oh, yeah. No,
Black Smoke. Black Smoke.
Yeah.
Black Smoke, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what is the one thing that you're trying to bring your audiences when you're writing these books? I mean, aside from, the high level piece that you just shared with us, why you started to write about this topic in the first place, what do you want people to take away?
So I want people to understand that Black culinary excellence has been with us from the earliest days of this country. And I am reviving a lot of those stories of excellence. And in some ways, I am bringing to light things that have been either underreported or underappreciated. So that's really it's really about celebrating Black excellence and to understand that American food would not be what it is today without the contributions of African Americans.
Mm. And so part of what you do now is I understand it, is that, and what you do and what you have done in the past is that you travel around the country, obviously, to get these stories and to talk to people. I'm curious as to what your perspective is from when you started traveling to more recent times in terms of what the temperature is of the people that you're talking to, the communities that you visit, and what it is today. So tell me a little bit about that, especially putting on your social justice lens, which is so important to you.
Right. So we're not talking about weight gain, right?
We're not talking about weight gain.
All right, cool. So, there's only so much you can get from reading cookbooks and reading newspaper articles and reading books and other things about the food story of a community. You have to just be on the ground. And so what's been really interesting to me is to see how food traditions have changed. And in many ways, how they've stayed the same over time, and then also the ways that they've changed to adapt for the times. But to see the ways that African Americans are doing what often is called food sovereignty, trying to take control of what they eat and their food access. Because food access, at least access to nutritious food, has been a challenge for a lot of communities. A lot of the food choices available tend to be convenience food, fast food, and other things. And so what's been really interesting is to see people going back to gardening, which was a mainstay of our community for a long time. Even as enslaved people, typically on a plantation, enslaved people were allowed to cultivate their own patch of ground, and were so good at it that they often had the opportunity to sell excess produce at a nearby town or market. And we have examples of enslaved people buying their freedom because of the money they made selling the food that they grew or the animals that they raised, or eggs or other things like that. So that's part of our history. So it's been cool to see that come back at an individual and family level in terms of what people are doing at their homes, but also the ways that we're seeing more and more Black churches get involved. One thing that churches have is a lot of land. And we're seeing more and more churches like cultivating some of that land they have and creating community gardens. So that's been fascinating for me. So just on the food justice part, this food sovereignty part, seeing that on the production side, but then also seeing people really being more intentional about what they eat and trying to have a healthy diet. And what I often tell people is soul food gets a horrible reputation, and people are like, oh, that food's killing us. But if you look at the history of soul food, it's celebration food. It is not meant to be eaten day in and day out. It's really meant to be eaten occasionally. So I tell people, no, love soul food and it needs more love, but just understand that the perspective is that this is a part of an overall diet, and that stuff that we celebrate in soul food is not meant to be eaten on the regular. Because if you're going to eat fried chicken, sweet potato pie, and all that stuff day in and day out, that's not going to be good for your body. And if you look at any culture's celebration food, it is not meant to be eaten on a regular basis. And so I think we've kind of gotten away from that. And then the third thing that I'll say is, in a lot of food writing circles, there's this idea of culinary justice. And what that discussion is about is, how do we remind people of the contributions that people of color have made to American food? Because in a lot of situations, African Americans especially have either been relegated to the sidelines or written out of the food storytelling altogether. And my books about soul food and barbecue really contravene that, because I'm saying, look, right now, you don't have a lot of people, at least in media, like I'm talking about TV and things like that. You don't hear about soul food that much, but you hear about Southern food. And usually the chefs that are celebrated are white. And it's really bad in barbecue. I mean, you wouldn't even know a brother or sister grills at all looking at the TV shows and the media coverage about barbecue. So my work has often been a thump on the head to say, look, we have made significant contributions to these things that we love. Yeah. And here's how it happened. Here's why it happened. And here's why we should continue to celebrate.
We grew up with that. I mean, I can see my mother in the backyard of our house right now with the grill that she had and the hickory chips. And she would never wash that grill because she did not want the flavor. She did not want the flavor to go away. I mean, it was like years and years. So the history is there. I mean, every Black person, probably has a memory like that. I can smell it right now if I close my eyes. So you talked about more of the contributions that African Americans have made that have not been recognized. And your book, The President Kitchen's Cabinet, is very specific in talking about the contributions of African American chefs in the White House. So talk to us a little bit about that, and what surprised you as you were researching and writing that book. What surprised you most?
Yeah, so that book is a collective biography of African-American presidential chefs and cooks. And the thing that surprised me, which is it shouldn't have surprised me, is that every president has had an African-American cooking for them in some capacity. And the reason why that surprised me is because I didn't know how extensively African-Americans shaped American food. And a lot of our early presidents were slaveholders. And so they brought their enslaved cooks with them to the White House for a couple of reasons. One is they wanted to get the food that they liked on a reliable basis, right, on a regular basis. But the other thing is, before President Truman, presidents had to pay for their domestic staff out of their own pocket. So if you wanted to save money as a president, rather than hiring somebody on the free market in D.C., it made a lot of sense to bring your enslaved cook with you because you weren't paying that person anything. And they were providing you with good food. So the dominance of African Americans in the presidential kitchen surprised me just to the extent that it was. And if you were to take all of the presidential chefs, put them in a room, most of those chefs would be Black women. That has been the typical White House cook. Now it's changing because ever since President Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, as First Lady, wanted to change the trajectory of White House cooking. So she was really emphasizing kind of, continental cuisine. So high-end French and other types of cooking. And so the Black folks working in the White House kitchen didn't have that expertise. So as people transitioned out of their jobs, retired, whatever, more and more classically trained chefs were hired. So the story of the last, say, 40 years is definitely different than the first, say, 150 years of White House history.
This episode is brought to you by BMW of West Houston.
Hi, this is Robert Ory, the 7-time NBA champ, also known as Big Shot Bob. BMW of West Houston has provided me and my family with the best service and the best experience for years. BMW has been there for me and my family for years, so much so that it has convinced my wife to switch over from a former brand to BMW, and she loves it. BMW has been the car to drive. It is the ultimate driving experience.
So tell me, Adrian, how your work in this space, in the culinary space, dovetails and perhaps I would imagine informs the work that you're doing on social justice, and especially with the work that you're doing, as in Colorado as part of the council and across denominations, et cetera. How do those two things work together?
Well, the way I'm seeing it now is we have fewer and fewer spaces in our society where people from all walks of life can come together. And the church is one of those spaces that's left, and also the table when we think about restaurants and places like that. So a lot of what I've been thinking about lately is how can we bring people to a space where we can get to know each other, that it feels like a safe space, and that people feel like they can be themselves in that space. And that's getting harder and harder given the political polarization that we have and the wariness that we have of each other. What I'm finding about this is that people of color often have a reluctance to go into a space because there's a weariness that we're always the ones that have to come to a space and explain to white people what it's like to be a marginalized person in this society and persuade them to do the right things and to educate. On the other side, I find that there are several white people who want to come to this space, but they're reluctant because they don't want to be the bad person in the space. They don't want to say the wrong thing that's going to alienate. So there's a nervousness about coming into that space. So my feeling is that food may be the one thing that would overcome the weariness and the wariness on each side, and at least bring people to a table and have a chance to talk about these things. And in addition to food, I think faith is another connector that can make those connections happen. And I've tried to do this a couple times in Denver, and usually, and this probably doesn't surprise you, there's usually an initial spurt of activity. People are in it, but then over time it wanes. And so I think two challenges are, how do you get people into a space? And then how do you get them committed to stay in that space over time so that we can really get to know each other and have reconciliation?
I'm so glad that you're bringing this to the forefront, and it really connects to actually a podcast that I just did. I interviewed this woman for the second time, and I'm going to connect you with her. And the podcast, excuse me, is called, it's about Neighbor's Table. And it's a woman in, I don't know if you've heard of it, but, it's a woman in outside of Dallas who started on her own, and she asked her dad to build her a table. And then she started inviting total strangers to come to her home and sit in the backyard and have a meal. And it could be the grocery sacker. It could be the guy who was working down the street in the yard. I mean, people from all walks of life. And then she would set the scene, the ambiance, if you will, by creating an inclusive atmosphere and making everybody feel that it was okay to be there and to just be who they are, and let's share a meal together. It's yes. Yeah, you two need to meet. So that's going to happen. I'm going to connect you guys because there's, if nothing else, you'll just have a great conversation. But I just think that it's so simple, but it's so important. And like you said, there's so few opportunities or places where we feel safe enough now to be in mixed company, whether that's racially mixed, politically mixed, ethnically, whatever, because we are just at such polar opposites, and it's frustrating. So do you feel hopeful at all about where we are and what we need to do to get where a better place?
I do feel hopeful, and I just have to say the murder, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd gave me hope when I didn't think I was going to have any. And let me just say it this way. Typically, when something happens like that, there's intense interest. It's kind of like what I was saying with the with these coming to the table. It's intense interest. People want to do the right thing, and then it dissipates after a couple months. I have to say, I mean, we're almost 2 years from that. And people have been more engaged about racial justice and reconciliation. So it's just something's different where people are hanging in there. Not a lot. I mean, there's been some drop off, but there's still a lot of people who are interested in that. And I've been very encouraged by seeing efforts, sometimes started by white people on their own after reading books. And, there was a whole litany of books that people were suggested to read who have gone on to do things like create individual reparations accounts or create amplify funds to support Black folks in certain industries. So what I'm seeing is a desire to come together. I think the challenge right now is people don't know how. And so I think what this woman's doing with the neighbors table, I think people are waiting for folks to create those safe spaces. And so people are looking how to connect. So I don't think it's a lack of interest. I just think it's like, I don't know what to do next. I've read the books. I've got the mindset. Now what? And so we just need more what I call reconciliation entrepreneurs to figure out those creative ways to do that. And you're finding it. It's the neighbors table. You're seeing people create apps and digital platforms where you can connect with strangers and have conversation. I just did something a few months ago called Unify America. And what you do is you sign up and then you fill out a questionnaire, and then they pair you with someone who's very different than you are. And the only obligation is for 30 minutes to an hour, you agree to talk to each other, and they're facilitated questions.
Yep.
And the whole point is to show, you think we're really different, but we're not so much.
We're not so much. That's the whole point of why I started the podcast, almost 3.5 years ago now, just to try to, help us see a little bit of ourselves and other people that we might consider to be the other. Because we're all somebody's other, for one reason or another. We're all somebody's other. Is there a particular time in your life or in your travels, particularly as you go around the country, where you were made to feel like the other, something that stands out in your mind that kind of helped shape what you do, how you show up in the world today? Is there something that stands out in your mind that you could share with us?
But you know what? Interestingly enough, it doesn't have to do with my travels. It's actually being here in Denver, Colorado. So I think Colorado has this reputation for being just like a progressive place. It's not in the South or anything. There's no racism. And that's quite the opposite. I've been called the N-word more in Colorado than I have in the South. And I've been in the South a lot traveling. And so it's a reminder that no matter where we go, it's a challenge to be a Black person in this society because we're not fully accepted. And to have these random kind of, and I'll just give you an example. I was standing at an intersection just waiting for the light to change. Car drives by, this guy yells out the window, "Well, hello there, N-word." And it transported me back to grade school in the suburbs of Denver, where I was walking home from school and during elementary school, and a teenager did the exact same thing to me. So like 35 years later, it's kind of like this bookend. And so that was a reminder to me that, wherever I go, there's work to be done.
Yeah. And
I think the challenge for people of goodwill, and I don't put the onus all on people of color. I think white people of goodwill who want to see a multicultural and inclusive society need to take this challenge as well. It's just, how do we assess our gifts and figure out how to use them to bring people together? And so I'm just reminded of that constantly. And I think I'm blessed in the sense that I've found this thing that I love, food and food history. And I've figured out a way to draw people in and tell these stories and get people to think about things by writing and telling stories about food. And one of the consistent compliments that I get, and maybe it's a backhanded compliment, but people will say to me, I didn't know what to make of either your book or your talk or whatever, but you're just more interesting than I thought you would be. And you got me thinking about stuff. I'm like, okay, that's cool.
Thank you, I think, right? Yeah, right. Oh my gosh. Well, I have to say, I've seen you on stage and you are such a brilliant speaker. I mean, to our audience, if you ever get the chance to go see Adrian on stage and have him talk about just life, and food and all of the things that we're discussing here today, do not run to go see it, because you are such a gifted storyteller and you bring people in, and clearly you're funny as all get out. Okay. I mean, I've been cracking up since we started. So, your humanity comes through, and obviously your intellect and your intelligence and your empathy and compassion. And so it's just, I love what you're doing, and I want to know what's next. What is next on your plate? On your plate? Haha.
I see what you did there. I see what you did there.
Can you see what I did there? Can you break some news on our Voices Matter podcast?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, thank you for blessing me with that. That really encourages me. So thank you. So there's two things I'm thinking about right now. I am actually working with the Museum of Boulder to create an exhibit on Colorado's Black history. And that will go live September of 2023. And what people don't know, Colorado has a bad rap. And I tell people, Colorado is very diverse. We've got all kinds of white people. Just kidding. But no, we've had well, not so much, but we've had a lot of interesting African Americans show up in the state. And I want to tell that collective story. Since the 1830s and 40s, we've had African Americans in the area that would become Colorado, pushing for civil rights, becoming entrepreneurs who achieved great wealth, making contributions to society in all kinds of interesting ways. So there'll be the exhibit, and I hope to eventually write a book about the African American experience in Colorado. Food-wise, I'm really excited about this. I'm working on a book on African American street vendors, and I want to show how these entrepreneurs shape the food scenes of places like New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah, Harlem, Chicago, DC, Philadelphia. So many examples of not only did they show business acumen, but how they introduced ingredients and dishes from Africa and popularized them, how they unwittingly displayed Africa to people, because outside the community, people were just looking at this saying, oh, that's kind of weird or picturesque or whatever word they would use. But the ways that these people did their street cries to get you to buy their stuff reflected African musical traditions. Some say that these street cries were the roots of the blues. Also the colors that they wore, the way they carried their food around, like carrying, balancing things on their head. The dominance of Black women in this tradition. But here's the really cool thing. Between, say, the 1880s to the 1930s, there are several people who listened to these street cries and then set them to sheet music. So my hope is to get a book deal where I can put out a compilation of these street cries, narrate them, and hire somebody who can read street music to replicate the cries. So you'll get an idea of what it was like to be in, say, 1890s New Orleans and have someone trying to get you to buy their pralines.
Oh, that is just brilliant. I love that. Wow. Well, I just, I just love everything that you're doing and the way that you've taken all of your many talents to help, create a better and a more just world in a way that, your gifts are uniquely suited for. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Okay, time now to switch it up, which means that you get to ask me whatever you want. Be kind.
No, definitely. This is an easy one. So okay. What is your just favorite childhood food memory? You talked about your mom at the grill. Maybe it's that one, but I'm just wondering if there's another one.
Oh, gosh. So I think one of them is, and so you and I both went to Stanford, not at the same time, but we both did. And when I would come home to Chicago, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I would go home from school, and my mom would always ask me, what do you want your first meal to be when you come home? And it would always be, and it was soul food. It was fried chicken. It was greens. It was hot water cornbread. Yeah. So my mother grew up in Nashville, And I'll tell you and that brought me to another food memory. My grandmother and my great aunt lived in the same house when I was a little girl. And I can remember when we would go to visit them in Nashville, waking up to the smell of fried apples. Oh my gosh. Fried apples with cinnamon and sugar and bacon and sausage and grits. And I mean, it's like the aroma would just kind of, get you out of bed. Oh yes. And homemade biscuits, right?
Wow.
Like you said, drop it like a hot biscuit, right?
Yep.
Okay. My grandmother and my aunt made the best biscuits and homemade rolls. Oh my gosh.
Wow.
The best.
That's impressive.
And my other grandmother on my father's side, her specialty was coconut cake.
I was just about to ask you if you had a dessert specialty.
Yeah. The dessert specialty from my grandmother on my dad's side was coconut cake. Nobody made a coconut cake like Mama. And that's what we called her, Mama. She was incredible.
So
best.
please tell me that somebody in the family learned the recipe and the artistry and can come close. I know probably can't make it exactly, but can at least come close.
There might be, but it's not me, unfortunately. Unfortunately. But I have my mother's cookbook, and I'll tell you what I have. I have a recipe for chess pie.
That's not something you see every day. Oh, I know what it is.
Handwritten by my grandmother. I have it. I have a lot of her recipes that are literally in her handwriting from ages ago. I should show it to you. I'll show it to you.
Yeah,
I have a lot of that stuff. I have a lot of the handwritten recipes from my mom, my grandmother, and my great aunt.
Oh, you should have somebody type those up.
Yeah. Well, I've typed up some of them.
Okay.
The ones that I make on a regular basis, I have typed up because otherwise I would lose them. But yeah, you're right. I should do that.
Yeah. And just make a little small cookbook, privately publish it.
Yeah.
People would love it. I would love that.
I'll share with you, I promise.
Okay. One more quick question. Is there a caramel cake tradition in your family?
I have had caramel cake. I don't know. I want to say yes. I mean, now that you mention it, there might be, but I can't think of a specific instance of where I can say, oh yeah, I had that caramel cake on that day and it was so incredible. I've had it though.
Yeah. Because
Why do you ask?
Well, I've eaten soul food across the country, and I have to say that I often see caramel cake as a restaurant dessert option in Tennessee and in Southside Chicago. It's not something you see every day. Because I think of Southside Chicago as transplanted South. I mean, you see a lot of food traditions show up there. So I just wonder, my dad, that's my dad's favorite cake. He gets so happy if somebody makes it the right way. Yeah. So
I love caramel anything. So I do like caramel cake. So I probably did have it as a child. I just don't have a specific memory of it. But it's just so fun and interesting because once you started asking me the question, I thought, oh yeah, coconut cake. Oh yeah, this. There are all of these things that come to mind, and lots of really wonderful memories. That's what food does for us.
Yes, absolutely.
And it brings us together, and you, my dear, are bringing us together with the work that you're doing. So again, Adrian Miller, thank you so much for sharing yourself and your work with our audience. Really, really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, so suddenly I'm craving all of my favorite soul food. Thanks so much to Adrian for joining us for today's episode. And thank you for being a part of our audience. We so appreciate you. Go to the show notes for links to everything that Adrian is up to, and then join us again for the next episode of our Voices Matter podcast. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thanks again to our sponsor, BMW of West Houston. There's a special offer for members of the Our Voices Matter podcast community. Just click the link in the show notes, bmwwest.com.